afternoon on what it is we would like the next conference to actually focus upon. So building on the conferences we've had in the past, the last one in 2019 was about managing the fuel and reducing the risk, and the guiding principle for this next one is wildfires, the human dimension. So we can encourage you either to participate in a brief conversation just now, or to add your thoughts into the chat bar, and we can pick up on that as well. We're just picking up on some of the things we mentioned already this afternoon about controlling the fire triangle is something that Casey mentioned in her presentation. And Craig Hope alluded to the fact that if we have less fires, then we've got more fuel, and a fire not burnt now is a fire put off for later. And we all know that almost without exception, there are exceptions, but almost without exception, fires tend to be started by people, fought by people, and perhaps that working together both to prevent them happening, to raise awareness amongst the public, and to consolidate our practice both as responders and as land managers would be a good starter for 10 for how the conference should proceed. So I'll pause there. I see that Rob Gazard has his hand up. So Rob, I'll bring you in at this point.
Thank you very much there, Bruce, for the introduction. So the next conference in November 2022 will be probably a year after we delivered our first LANTRA accredited UK wildfire training, which is both prevention elements to it and also response elements to it for land managers. So I wonder whether that will be useful, because it's very much the human element about upskilling the land management sector in a coordinated and standardized way across the country, and also has elements in there about land fuel management from the prevention side on wildfire management plans and prescribed fire burning. So I wonder if that will be of interest to colleagues across the UK.
Thanks for that, Rob. I'm sure it will be. The combination of shared practice, good practice, and prevention in that training is absolutely something that pulls the different strands together. So thank you for that. I'm seeing in the chat that we've got a couple of suggestions as well. The health impacts on the public and responders. So Andy Elliott's mentioned that in relation to how that affects people, and that'd be post-incident, and how we can either mitigate that or manage that once it happens, or if it happens. And Rodri, who's one of our wildfire investigators in the UK FRS, is talking about the public perception of wildfires. Again, it's all about that human dimension, how people perceive wildfires, so that might be of interest as well. Rob, you still have your hand up. Is that an old hand or a new hand? I'll take it to an old hand. That's it, thank you. Folks, anybody else got any thoughts that they might want to put towards helping guide the conference in 2022? There's no comment.
Simon, perhaps I can just chip in. I think the key thing is trying to get this balance and trying to make sure there's something in the conference for everyone. But I think also there needs to be this, we need to make sure that we're not trying to overstuff the conference. I think there's always a temptation to put more stuff in because it's all of it's important, but it's trying to find that right balance. So I think it's, if people can contribute their thoughts and ideas, it will then allow a sift to come through the Belfast team, as I'm calling you, Chairman Column, to come up with some ideas. But I think it's trying to find that reach that makes the conference interesting, that people will want to engage with it, but at the same time not making it too complicated to follow, with too many breakout groups competing with each other. And I think it's a move into other areas. We need to make sure that there's something there for government, for policy, and the agencies in terms of the conservation. We've mentioned human health, which I think is an area we need to get better at, but also looking at the impact on habitat conservation and the like. So I think there's a lot there, but I think it would be really helpful if people gave it some thought and then fired in some ideas as to what would make the conference interesting for them, which is perhaps what we're fishing for at the moment.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for that, Simon. And there's some really good suggestions now coming into the chat bar about subjects that could be covered. Prescribed burning versus conservation interests in different habitats, for example. That's a very short sentence, but a massive subject to be covered, and someone that could probably capture the entire conference, to be honest. And about engaging those that are otherwise not keen in joining the conversation, absolutely. These are the people we really need to be involved in the conversation, because that's where we can see the biggest benefit, in my view. Those that are not yet involved in that conversation, but absolutely have a perspective and receive an impact from wildfires. Katie, your suggestion there about the flammability of different vegetation types is an excellent suggestion, because that would point towards how we can influence planting patterns and get that variegated, resilient landscape that we strive to achieve. And I guess that's a very science-led discussion that would be of huge interest to lots of people. There's loads of chat coming in now, which is fantastic. Jim, no, I don't know how or if you're capturing all of this, but
Yes.
some really good subjects being put forward now.
Very good. Yep.
Can I also encourage you, put some thought into it, not just now, but over the coming days and weeks. Both the England and Wales Wildfire Forum and the Scottish Wildfire Forum have their meetings in the next couple of weeks, well, certainly within November. So these are opportunities to channel information back through those fora. If you're not a member of those fora, then I'm sure both Noel and Jim would be absolutely delighted to hear from you in the interim period. I see Matt has his hand up. Matt, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bruce. Just going on again about this, the land management side. I think if the conference can give us an opportunity to look at these new management plans that are coming in for wildfire mitigation. Particularly, we've got one just recently at Quilca and Slieve Bay, which are huge areas. The scale of the proposals are really big, very complex, require a broad group of stakeholders from farmers, land managers, the NGOs, government departments, and policy implications. So I think if these type of reports are going to be encouraged now and coming through more, we need to look at these and sort of break them up and start seeing actually what are the real implications of these and how really can we try and deliver them. Because I got a feeling they're going to maybe start coming in thick and fast a little bit. We need to really be learning as we go along on the implication of those. And as I say, sharing particularly between land managers, because that's often who's at the coalface with this, of when these reports and plans are given to them. It's like, how are we actually going to implement this? And it's about managing those expectations, because it's fine to have a report, but another thing to implement it and implement it strategically. So I think if we can look at that within the conference, that'd be great too.
Thanks for that, Matt. That's a really good suggestion. And I think that strategic overview with all parties involved, so we all have the same understanding of what the ask is and how we can come together collegiately to meet that ask is always going to be welcome. And when I say collegiate, we remove the barriers between, or the imaginary borders between the devolved administrations, and just talk about the UK at large and get that real UK approach rather than a disparate approach that we sometimes see, which sometimes is necessary, granted, but if we can get past that, then it's a much stronger position to be in. Jim, did you want to come in as well?
I just wanted to mention, just in case people were thinking that we were trying to replicate the conference, there's obviously a major aspect that we want to cover in the conference that we're not covering here, and that's the input from universities and research. That would be an additional aspect that we'll want to put into that. But also with Matthew, just talking there, beyond the 2 days, we would hope to be able to put on field trips to look at practice on the ground and particularly in terms of land management. So just wanted to highlight those two aspects.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. Jim, Noel, I'm conscious of the time and the next step of the agenda is coming up. There's lots and lots of topics that are getting put in the chat bar now, which is fantastic. And thanks to everybody that's making suggestions there. I'm quite happy to hand back to you at this point, Jim, so you can tee up the next speaker, or I'm happy to facilitate more discussion if you want.
Well, listen, I think if people keep putting those suggestions in, you were asked about how we're recording that. You'll see Noel's head go down. He's got a pen and what's called a pen and paper. But we're also copying. We're also copying properly. But I just belt and braces. We thought we'll just do pen and paper as well. So listen, thank you very much for that, Bruce and Simon. And I was worried at the start, and I've got 15 comments, so no, get scribbling and screen shooting the screen, etc. Thank you very much for that. I think that we're in safe hands as far as that's concerned. We're a minute or two a little bit early, but I warned Lyndon that we would be swapping. As I say, Dean and Grant are having possible electrical supply issues at this particular time planned, so we're going to swap that round. So Lyndon, if you're about.
Yep.
Yeah. And you should be able to, you have the floor. I don't know if you have a presentation to share or you're just talking to us.
Yeah, could you make me co-host again? I got disconnected and.
Okay, will do. Give me a minute. That should be you, Lyndon.
There we go.
If I just introduce you as the senior expert in terms of vegetation, fire management, resilience program, European Forest Institute. I'd love to hear a bit more as far as that's concerned. And I honestly like to throw in we're seeing a significant potential change in terms of new woodland creation and broadleaf. And I personally think that's going to have a big change in terms of the fire risk, but that's just something to mention. I'll just hand over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I guess I can't say I'm the expert on vegetation fire management at EFI because I share that with my colleague Alexander Held, as most of you know him. So we are a double team of troublemakers. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. Apologize in advance if I have a coughing fit in between. I've been a little under the weather the last couple of days. But in any case, yeah, I guess to introduce myself a little bit, I am originally from California, where I kind of grew into the fire business, well, as a kid, since my dad was a wildland firefighter. So I had that growing up, and then I did wildland firefighting for the U.S. Forest Service for about 7 seasons before moving to Germany. And I've been in Germany now for a little over 7 years. And then since I've been working internationally on European projects, on projects in the Congo, on projects in Indonesia. So I've done a little bit of everything from basic level training to policy development, all the above. So my presentation today, I am talking a little bit as a kind of a neutral observer, since unlike Craig, as someone who actively deployed down to Greece this summer, this is the perspectives I'm going to offer are a bit of a kind of an outside observation, but also coming from, I've been chairing the thematic working group of the landscape fire crisis management of the Fire In project, which is a Horizon 2020 project. So that's been going for about 5 years. And during that, we've been working a lot with practitioners across Europe to gather their inputs, to understand what the capability challenges, what the gaps are. And so some of the first kind of half of that, well, actually a lot of it are not just, my personal opinions, but collected through surveys and many workshops. And the idea that I have is, I'll share a link in the chat. But I gave a similar presentation at the Northwest European Roundtable on fire management just a month ago. And so I kind of want to just carry the message forward and encourage kind of a collaborative working together to come up with, just get some ideas down on paper, kind of chart a way forward. So I welcome input into that. And yeah, I'll mention that more further on. Okay, so just a little overview. Going to go over kind of the issue of root causes, a common language, bring in some ideas on maybe EU-wide fire complexity or preparedness rating, evolving past our reactive culture, a peacetime exchange mechanism, since much of what we do is on a voluntary basis and doesn't receive the type of support that we need. Promoting social inclusion and resilient landscapes, and finally a coordinated communication strategy. So what's important as we look at our wildfire challenges across Europe or across the globe is understanding that each of us face common challenges, each of us face also unique challenges. And many of these countries, they have kind of their own unique profiles of challenges. What are the causes of fires, both wanted or unwanted? And it's important that we acknowledge those and identify these main drivers in order to develop targeted approaches, whether maybe it's an arson problem in Italy, or it's agricultural burning in northeastern Europe, which is responsible for a positive feedback cycle of smoke being transported into the Arctic Circle, being deposited on ice, lowering the albedo, and in turn, melting the ice faster, rising the sea level, contributing more to the jet stream moving south. So many of these issues that we have globally, whether it's in the Amazon basin or in the tropics of Southeast Asia, I mean, they come back to very specific drivers, which are very often socially motivated or culturally motivated or economically motivated. And so if we look at our global challenges or our regional fire challenges and our climate, our climate change issues, a lot of these are very closely linked. But there is certainly a lacking connection being made where we can really develop targeted approaches for supporting change in these different areas, whether it's supporting modes of agriculture that don't involve burning or slash and burn, and to then, once we've developed different approaches and understood these issues better, we can also exchange the solutions that we have. We've come to gain through trial and error, or in many cases, it's reviving traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge of how to do fire more sustainably in the landscape, which is ultimately what's required is this exchange of principles and practices which support our fire resilient societies and landscapes. And then, moving into the operational level, and this is, these are some of the topics that maybe Craig also addressed, is this development of a common language in order to more safely and effectively cooperate across borders. We have these instances now where countries are being mobilized to help one another. But in some cases, the people that are going into these contexts maybe have never really dealt with wildland fire before. Many of the firefighters from Germany that went down to Greece had little to zero real experience with wildland fire, and here we are putting them in a context where we have a pretty severe fire situation where a country that is very experienced with fires is unable to cope themselves. So it's very important that we, at the operational level, we develop these different common languages to be able to more safely and effectively deploy. So first and foremost, we need a kind of a common understanding of fire ecology and behavior. And a lot of what I'm going to say is very obvious, But I'm sure many of you know that just because it's obvious doesn't mean it's the state of the art or being observed in practice. So, you know, fire ecology or fire regimes are, you know, vastly different in different areas, even across Europe. Their cultural use, their natural regimes, whether by lightning, or the human induced regimes, like we see, you know, vary exponentially in the Mediterranean basin. So we need to better understand the role of fire in these different contexts to better understand which management objectives to set. I mean, do we want to suppress all fires? Do we want to end up dealing, you know, creating a problem for ourselves down the road, like the US example, where, you know, 100 years of mismanagement or you know, aggressive fire suppression has led to the conflagrations that we have today. So it's important that especially as new countries start to deal more with fire, that we don't make the same mistakes as we have in the past. And particularly those in the suppression environment know that understanding fire behavior is very different if you're putting it out or if you're conducting a prescribed burn. I think myself, like many others, never really thought too much about fire behavior and fire analysis and really understanding how fire moves in the landscape during my time as a firefighter, because we had the singular mission of containing anchor and flank, put it out. And then once you get more into prescribed fire and fire effects, we can understand fire much better and be able to better manage fire when there is fire, and to understand, okay, do we need to put it out, or is this something we can manage for other objectives? And finally, the benefit of knowing fire ecology and fire behavior for the different contexts is when we deploy across borders, that we then know a little bit what to expect when we get there, because, you know, what a firefighter might be, you know, experiencing in terms of fire behavior in Sweden is certainly not going to be the case in Turkey or Greece or you know, somewhere in the Mediterranean. And then training. I mean, training is such a fundamental, yet once again an obvious point. But a lot of countries across Europe, they have been fighting wildland fires for decades, but not had any formal training that's specific to wildland fire and understanding the wildland fire environment. And this is something that's just increasingly I've run across in so many different countries, where they put out fires and they deal with fires, but you know, you can even see it in the imagery in the media from this past summer. Just, you know, firefighters who presumably have a wealth of experience in fighting wildland fires, there they are in an environment where water is finite, and they're spraying, you know, they're aiming their nozzle at the top of a 30-meter flame wall. And so you can see that there's just a real lacking in just fundamental basic training and experience on using the fire triangle to understand how to suppress fire, how to put it out. And once again, I mean, it seems very obvious, but these are things that in my experience have been confirmed over and over and over again, that this is in fact a missing thing. And it leads to, you know, ineffectual use of resources, and whether personnel or water or, you know, what have you. And yeah, and it's dangerous. I mean, if you're putting yourself in front of a wall of fire, it's obviously not, you know, a understanding the principles of strategy and tactics that you need in order to safely fight fire. That said, you know, training obviously then leads to competency-based positions, you know, having qualifications and being in a position to lead others and manage incidents based on competencies. And a challenge, you know, for instance, here in Germany, there's a big challenge because without experience, how do you, in the US, you have a task book system. So you prove over and over and over again that you know how to fulfill a certain function before you get signed off to be qualified in order to, act in that role. And in countries or contexts where you don't get that experience, in order to, repetitively demonstrate your competency in fulfilling that role or function, the only way you can do that is by gaining that experience outside of your context. And when that, high impact, low frequency event occurs in your area, you are prepared to deal with it. And that's where this international exchange, the opportunity, for instance, for resources to assist across borders is absolutely critical, but it's also a double-edged sword, because doing so in the heat of the moment, or when shit hits the fan, it can definitely be dangerous. One way of doing this would be to have more kind of standardized or common modules on basic fire, fire suppression, fire prevention, the whole gamut. And common terminology is, of course, very important to be able to understand each other when working across, even county lines, especially in countries that are highly divided up into state systems that are different. And finally, this practical experience is just invaluable. I mentioned prescribed fire as an opportunity to really learn fire before having to put out fire. And that's, cannot be understated, its value. And then, of course, safety is an issue where I've kind of been watching these international deployments over the years, wondering, geez, how do they manage to still come home at the end of the day? Because they occur in a way that is absent of kind of commonly agreed upon emergency procedures. What happens when you get in a bad situation? And do we agree on how to conduct evacuations? Do we agree on when, where to set our trigger points, when to pull out, what time, at what point is our strategy need reevaluation? To my knowledge, there's not really any sort of across the board way of addressing that. And communicating risks. I mean, communication challenges, breakdown in communication is a contributing factor to every single firefighter death. It is always an issue, and working across borders and different contexts is really a strain on being able to communicate. So, and then finally, I mean, we have kind of agreeing on technical standards. This is something that, the European Commission or certifying bodies would eventually have to agree on what safety standards need to be met in order to deploy. And maybe it seems obvious as well, but even like physical fitness. In this country, in Germany here, we have nearly 1.5 million volunteers. Most of the fire departments are all volunteers, in which case, there's no standards for physical fitness or anything like that, which, for me is obviously mind-boggling, coming from the US, where your physical fitness is your lifeline. So these are things that in some contexts don't get talked about, but maybe we need to be thinking. And then, yeah, of course, one other thing is obviously the air-to-ground coordination. We have these a lot of air resource deployments, and these have worked out, with the minor exception here and there. They've worked out well so far, but as we see, with the Russian tanker that went down, aerial firefighting is an extremely dangerous affair, and it takes years and years to coordinate such efforts in a way that can be ensured to be safe. As far as technical interoperability goes, we had, like Craig mentioned, they didn't take their equipment down, but had they, would they, is their equipment suited to operate across borders? If a German fire truck drives across the border into the Netherlands, is the hose fitting going to be the same? Are they going to be able to refill from a hydrant? So these are kind of these technical things where, as we move towards a more kind of globalized society, as we move towards, working across borders as if they weren't there, we have, dozens of different systems and technical standards and the way things look. And these are things that we need to be working on already. Also, standardizing maps so that when you get to another area, the water, the symbol for water source, is that something that is universally recognized? These are all things to consider. The command systems and compatibility between them is a topic that within Europe has been kind of a heated discussion, whether ICS is warranted, or because of how quickly fires move here, is it not warranted? Is it not adaptable enough for the fast moving fires where you have all your damage occurring in the first few hours of an incident? Are these different command structures compatible with one another? When you arrive in another country, how do you get plugged in? How can we optimize these? Also across language barriers, can we have these quote unquote foreign resources integrated in a way that they're really working together well with the country, with the host country? And Craig mentioned there was no barrier, no real barriers in his experience in Greece, but that might not always be the case. Going into another country, English might not be a language spoken by the firefighters there. So these are certainly directions in which we need to develop. One, I hope I still have time. A couple of ideas that I'd like to put forward. So in Casey's presentation, she kind of showed the US National Preparedness Level Index of 1 to 5. And I've been wondering, is that not something that would be useful in the European context to be able to, more better harmonize efforts at the UCPM level, so that we can better pre-position resources or anticipate weather? With the Greece example, we had Greece, they sent over resources to Turkey. They sent some planes over, and then they immediately had to pull them back. Excuse me. And these sorts of situations in principle shouldn't need to happen, because the weather had been predicted, the conditions had been predicted for days that Greece was going to get hit really hard with that heat wave that week. And they still kicked their resources loose, which was obviously greatly appreciated. But at the same time, these are situations that we need to be able to avoid by having better planning at European level. And one way to do that, for instance, would be to develop some sort of fire complexity rating. In Spain, they've developed the fire complexity rating that they call generation fires, one through, I think they're up to 6 now, generation fires, or 7 even. And this is a way for them to just know right off the bat what kind of fire they're dealing with, how complex it is, how extreme the fire behavior is. And if we have a kind of a EU-wide fire complexity rating, then when we have an incident in Croatia that needs resources from elsewhere, they know what to expect when they get there. And the competent personnel, the right personnel with the right qualifications, can be assigned to an incoming, to an incident based off of predictive services of what the weather's going to do, what the fire behavior is expected to do. And I think this would be one way to optimize resource sharing in a way where we're better prepared to deal with these extreme fire situations like we saw this summer. Oops. Am I still there? Okay. Ultimately, we need to evolve past our reactive culture. So now, suppression aside, we've, to put things in perspective, a National Institute for Science and Technology Foundation report from the US, from, I think it was 2017. So based on numbers from 2016, estimated that the annual economic impact of wildland fire in the United States in 2016, or annually, was up to $347.8 billion a year. I mean, that's a huge amount of money that's invested in the entire infrastructure of damage, of preparedness, of response. But none of that includes any sort of review and analysis, risk reduction. So we need to look at where our investments are going. And obviously I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but even just, finding ways to frame some of these numbers are perhaps a way to convince our political leaders that we really need to change the way we invest in our landscapes, and that we review and analyze the seasons past and really quickly learn and adapt. Portugal, I think, is a great example of a very rapid, very steep learning curve, where after their fires in 2017, they reshuffled everything. They did major landscape level changes and policy. And I think we can learn from these examples and see that it's not mission impossible to change our priorities. Then, of course, we need to reduce the risks. And these risks, going back to my first point, I mean, these are often social, economic, environmental. These are challenges within the landscape. And in order to avoid these future catastrophic fires, the recovery and restoration component needs to be prioritized. We need to plan, plant, and build back better in a way where the next fire that goes through isn't going to devastate us because we've built a more resilient landscape. And then in order to kind of have a better or more effective and safe operational environment, it's very important that we have these exchanges take place in a peacetime setting, or not when there's a catastrophic fire going on. And in order for these to happen, we need to have acceptance from our bodies. If a German fire officer were to ask his boss if he could go burn in Catalonia for a week and still be paid, he'd probably get laughed at. So a lot of these exchanges occur because people volunteer their time or pay their own way, and we can't afford to leave people to their own devices in order to solve our wildfire problems. We need to actively lobby our institutions to better support this exchange of knowledge, during a time when we can do so in peace and quiet. I think there's an actual funding mechanism for this exchange of experts through DG ECHO, but I'd never really heard of it, and I don't know that many other people have. So maybe we need more diversified, funding mechanisms that ensure sustainable funding, and that we're not just battling for project money and keeping these projects going in order to pay our salaries, and that we have these more sustainable instruments that are recognized and supported by our governments. One way to kind of give a mandate for this would be to have some sort of agreement or compact or accords if you look at the 4 classical elements, you know, we have agreements for soils, we have agreements and conventions on water quality, on air quality, and the 4th element is fire, and we don't have any sort of agreements or accords on fire. Why not? Why can't we have some sort of agreement on sustainable fire use in our landscape, or something of the like? As far as you know, these exchange mechanisms go, we're not just talking about suppression. Obviously, we're talking about understanding how other people do fuel management, or how they plant trees differently, how they diversify tree crops, how do they still have economic returns but not do monocultures. How do you implement fire use using traditional practices back in the landscape? So these sorts of exchanges would be wonderful if they happened on all sorts of different thematic areas. And learning by doing, this training in prescribed fire is invaluable, as many of you know. And then to do so in different contexts, to have north-south, trips, to have north-north, to have countries that are experiencing troubles kind of on the same, they're new to both of them. You know, what are the guys in the UK doing that we could learn from in Germany? Or, maybe, we go down to Greece and see what they're doing there, but understanding that it's a different context, what can we take away? And then, obviously an idea would be some sort of secretariat for ensuring this sort of mechanism works out. But that's just a random idea. And then we need to promote social inclusion and resilient landscapes. I mean, this is the point that we all continually arrive at. And it's so difficult because there's this obvious disconnect between the fire and rescue services and civil protection, and then all these other actors dealing with fire. There's the fire fighters, and then there's the fire users. And how do we bridge that gap? Do we need these, fire and rescue services more integrated into landscape management approaches, and vice versa, so that there's more dialogue and understanding for these different approaches that need to happen hand in hand? And then integrated fire management must be delegated down. I mean, we need to revitalize these rural spaces. We need to bring people back into the landscape to break up these areas which have just fallen into disarray, overly crowded by fuels because people have fled the countryside, moved to the cities. We need to revitalize these landscapes. We need to revive these cultural practices in the landscapes to enhance this interface between response land managers and traditional land use. And that is something that we have seen very obviously as kind of a root cause for much of the fire activity in the Mediterranean region. Finally, we need a communication strategy, and we need consistent messaging to the media. The media likes to, obviously sensationalize the fires that we see, and that at times can be used to our advantage to push some of these issues. But we also need to train, media to cover the events holistically. And that was something that, for instance, I interacted with a lot of media over the summer, and if you just answer the questions that they ask, you'll end up contributing nothing. It's just, is it because of climate change, blah, blah, blah. It's always the same questions. It really takes a fair amount of effort and extra even research sometimes to just say, okay, this is how it is. And if you want to.
And we just have Wi-Fi and battery power on our laptop. So if we do disappear, that's why I can see the lights being moved around. We don't have lights in our offices.
My goodness.
Cool. Let me share my screen. So some people have seen some of this because it's linked to what we did a couple of years ago, but it's an update of the previous version. Can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to do the introduction and Grant will then take you through the technical aspects. So our talk this evening, or afternoon for you, but evening for us, is an interactive wild and urban interface wildfire risk assessment, and it's version 2. And this one's specifically focused on Table Mountain National Park, which is in the city of Cape Town. So one of the 7 wonders of the world, the context of our subject matter. And the city of Cape Town is predominantly a winter rainfall area. Fynbos, which is our very special vegetation, a biome in a province within a country, 9,500 plant species, of which 6,000 are only found here. So it's not just about fuel, but we actually have some rare plants. However, we also have a horrible record in our own country of being the most invaded alien plant species province, which is a big problem. And we have a 990 kilometer wild and urban interface, which we have to manage the risk of wildfire and environmental effects. And then, as if you know about South Africa, we have a huge discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. So we have urban fringe with very wealthy houses on the edge of it, or exactly the opposite, where we have informal settlements living right in our wild and urban interface. So the history and background to the project: in 2015, the Jeff Fynbos Fire Program, the Wild and Urban Interface Risk Assessment. Val Charlton is also online. They got, through their program, got funding and appointed the CSIR to run a program of assessing the wildfire risk on the edge of the city. And this was done in the Somerset West area, which is to the east of where I am at the moment. In 2015 to 2017, we were appointed by the Cape Peninsula Fire Protection Association through funding from 2 various funders to use the methodology, which we upgraded, to assess the north and the west wards of the Fire Protection Association. And that's what we presented just after the World Cup. I say that again, just after the World Cup in 2019, we presented in Wales on our first iteration of this project. And that was the entry slide. And some of the lessons we have learned since then, while the product was good, we learned that there were some limitations to it. When we put it into the market in Cape Town, we found there were some areas that weren't replicable. So, for example, to undertake a project of this nature, it took us almost 2 years just to do a portion of the city of Cape Town. If we wanted to do it for a larger area like a province or the rest of our country, it would take many, many years, and that's not a viable option. It wasn't cost effective. It wasn't easily updatable. So we've come up with a second version. I'm going to hand over to Grant because I'm not technically skilled to take you through the second part, but Grant will explain to you what he and the team have done to make this tool a better tool than the previous tool. So thank you. Over to Grant.
Afternoon all. Okay, thanks Dean for that. Before I get started with the technical side of things, I think it's important that I just outline how we see hazard and risk, how we've defined it for this process and for this project, because they are related, but they're not the same thing. So for us, hazard is the physical characteristics of the landscape or the environment, and how those actual characteristics give a potential to cause damage or cause loss, whether that be loss of life or financial loss. So we look at it as hazard as the physical nature of the landscape. So for example, the age of the vegetation, the aspect of a slope, the steepness of a slope, those are the sort of characteristics that we define in terms of our hazard. We then assess the risk by looking at the likelihood that a specific location will experience an actual event and how susceptible it is to that. And why we talk about location is because if you think about it, if you've got an area with an extreme hazard, but there's nothing there that's of consequence. So for example, there's not a property that might burn, causing an economic loss or loss of life, or even there's not a rare and endangered plant or animal there that could be lost, that hazard doesn't actually have a risk. You have to have something that you attach to it. So in terms of assessing the risk, we then estimate the exposure of those locations, for example, properties along the wild and urban interface, to those hazards. And we undertake what's called an exposure analysis, which essentially explores the spatial relationship between those locations of which we are concerned with the actual hazard factors. So as Dean said, I'm just going to go through this again. Just to emphasize it, the previous version was good. It did the job, but it had some shortcomings. It was reliant on up-to-date high-resolution aerial photos. It was an intensive manual mapping process, so it took a lot of man-hours, and it was thus difficult to update and took a long time to update. So we needed to find a method that was easier and quicker to update, that we could apply over larger areas, and wasn't reliant on this high-resolution current recent aerial photos, which are expensive and not always available. So what came along, thankfully, timelessly, was the announcement of the South African National Land Cover Project. We have had various iterations of land cover data sets that have been developed at various different stages, but this was something where it's now going to be produced on a regular basis. So it's based on 20-meter multi-seasonal sentinel imagery. Sentinel's relatively recent and is being used in lots of different applications. We define 73 different land cover classes across the whole of South Africa, which includes vegetation types, as well as human activities, settlements, in industrial areas, plantations, all those sorts of land classes. The great thing about it is that it's publicly available on an open license agreement. So we just download it when it becomes available. And it's going to be updated annually. It is being updated annually, because what they have done is they've developed a fully automated mapping process using AI and machine learning. So the first data set that came out was released in March 2019, which was based on imagery that was taken across the whole period of 2018. The first update was then released June last year based on 2019 imagery, and there has been an update released this year. Dean mentioned alien invasive plants being a major issue for us, and this is one of the limitations of the product as it currently stands, is that it doesn't include that as one of its land cover classes, and they're a major factor for fire hazard in the Western Cape. Okay, so in terms of the data inputs, these are the different layers that we then develop, separate hazard layers that we then model. The first three are all based on a fire history spatial database that is maintained by Table Mountain National Park, and that's the vegetation age, the fire size, and the number of fires. Then we've got two topographic factors, slope and aspect. Both are derived from a 25-meter digital elevation model, which is available for much of the country. And then the vegetation hazard, which is based on that national land cover data set that I mentioned from our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. This top bit here, Dean. Okay, vegetation age. Dean mentioned fynbos. That's essentially a local term for a lowland, for a low shrubland vegetation type, which is very fire prone and in fact dependent on fires for the maintenance of healthy vegetation communities. Older vegetation obviously presents a greater fire hazard due to an increase in the moribund plants, which raises the fuel load. So our vegetation age was based on the Table Mountain National Park Fire History Spatial Database, which goes back to 1962. So essentially at the end of every fire season, they map into a spatial database the extent of each of the fires and capture various details about the fire. So what we did is we worked at a 25-meter resolution, and for each 25-meter cell, we worked out the most recent fire, and then on that basis worked out the age of the vegetation post that recent fire. Then each of the cells was grouped into one of the 4 hazard classes, low, medium, high, or extreme. And in this instance, anything less than 5 years, for example, was low. Anything older than 15 years was an extreme hazard. So that's the vegetation. Next was fire size. Obviously, larger fires would represent a greater hazard to the surrounding communities. Again, it's based on that same Table Mountain National Park Fire History Spatial Database. But in this instance, we removed the planned and the prescribed burns. So here then for each 25-meter cell, we determined the size of the largest fire historically that had been recorded in that cell. And using a natural breaks classification system, which uses something called a Jenks optimization to try and find natural classes within your data. So you're not rigidly trying to impose it, you're letting the data speak for itself. We then assigned 4 different hazard classes on the basis of the fire sizes. The frequency of fires, obviously those areas which have experienced a greater frequency of fires, we would expect to have a higher fire hazard. Same database, the fire history database, again with the planned and prescribed removed. For each cell, we determined the number of fires historically that had occurred in each of those. And using the same classification system, we then assigned them, each of the cells, to one of the different hazard classes. Slope is an important topographic factor which affects fire spread. On steeper slopes, you get an increase in the speed of the fire, the speed at which it spreads through convective preheating, and you get an increased rate of ignition. Here we use the 25-meter digital elevation model to derive a slope surface, and then each of those individual slope ranges, slope percentages, were grouped into the different hazard classes. In this instance, it was less than 5% would be low, through to greater than 15% would be an extreme hazard. Aspect also affects fire behavior through variations in the amount of solar radiation that a slope would experience. And obviously the winds would also differ on different aspects. And in the southern hemisphere, it's our north-facing slopes that are the most favorable for fire start and spread. They're the hottest, they carry the greatest load, and in terms of sunshine, they have lower humidity and higher fuel temperatures. Again, the 25-meter digital elevation model was used to derive an aspect surface. And what we did is we took the hazard groupings that Nova et al. Used in the northern hemisphere. I think they were in Spain, and we just flipped it over for the southern hemisphere. So anything with a southerly aspect is a low hazard, through to anything with a northerly aspect would be an extreme or high hazard. Then finally, the vegetation risk. As mentioned previously, this is based on the National Land Cover Project data. And from that, we extracted only the vegetation classes, whether those be the indigenous classes or the cultivated ones. So for example, plantation forests. Then using the work that the CSR did that Dean mentioned earlier, we assigned a hazard class to each of the vegetation types, and that's based on the estimated fuel load, as well as the potential frequency and likelihood of a fire occurring in that vegetation type. I'm just showing 3 examples there in the table at the bottom of the slide. There's many more vegetation types, but just those 3 by way of example. So the low forest, for example, and thicket, very low fuel load, very infrequent fires with a rare likelihood, gets a low hazard, compared to the lowland shrubland fynbos, which has a high fuel load, relatively high frequency and likelihood of a fire occurring, and thus has a higher hazard value. So just to repeat this again, so then what we did is we took each of those individual data layers that we had now derived and modeled, and we combined them together to create a final summed layer, which we then put through a classification system to derive 4 final combined hazard classes. So this is an example for that same area that I've been using of what that looks like, from low through to extreme hazard. And this is a raster modeling approach. So we used a raster algebraic approach to generate the combined summed hazard map. And then again, the natural break system to classify into the summed values into 4 final hazard classes. And there's many uses for this map. I've just outlined 2 there. One is to identify those critical areas at the pre-fire season for hazard reduction interventions. For example, cutting of fire breaks, planned or prescribed burns to reduce fire hazard. But it's also useful during the fire season, and particularly during a fire event, to help inform firefighting activities. So if a fire is potentially moving into a high hazard area, that would then inform the activities that would be needed to actually prevent that happening. Then, in terms of the risk to properties along the wild and urban interface, we've taken this exposure analysis approach, essentially to characterize that risk for those properties. And risk is essentially described here by assessing the proportion of the different hazard classes within a particular area of influence around each of the properties. I've just taken a few examples there. You can see the areas around each of the properties. And we then extract within those areas the areas of the different classes, and we can then chart them and create those tables. So the 2 examples there, the one in the south, you can see very low hazard, so relatively low in terms of its risk profile, through to the ones on the northern side, which have a high incidence of the extreme hazard class. That immediately starts telling us where we need to start putting some action in. Additionally, we can look at other things which would influence the vulnerability of a property. So for example, what I'm showing here is a drive time assessment. So this is all aimed at looking at possibly how long it might take firefighting resources to reach a particular property when an event happens. So we have the location of the fire stations, and we use the road network to then derive these drive time polygons. And essentially each of the polygons is showing a particular time period that it would take to drive within those areas. So the dark green is less than 2.5 minutes from those fire stations, with the light green being between 2.5 and 5 minutes. So obviously we would be concerned if properties have a high risk profile and they have a longer drive time here as well. So thankfully that one in the south there, that has mainly low hazard, it is outside of the 5 minutes. If we were to say that would be a cutoff, but not necessarily an issue at this stage. Bearing in mind, obviously, that this hazard map does change as the vegetation ages, as fires happen, as land cover changes. So that situation could obviously change. So in conclusion, the previous method for assessing wildfire risk along the interface was difficult to update and required very intensive manual inputs and expensive inputs. The newly developed approach allows us to rapidly update the actual model and the final data sets. Whenever new data is available, whenever Table Mountain National Park, for example, produces a new spatial data set of fire history, we can immediately update it, as well as the national land cover data set. The resultant hazard map gives us critical data for both planning during the pre-fire season, as well as informing firefighting activities during an event, but also allows us to develop profiles for individual properties along the wildland-urban interface. And finally, we have applied the same model to a much larger area. So we did it for Cape Nature, which is the Provincial Conservation Agency of the Western Cape. We applied the same model to their entire conservation estate. We were lucky in that instance. They also have a spatial database of fire history. In instances where that isn't the case, we would have to lean on other sources. So Earth observation platforms, for example, like MODIS, which dates back to about 1999. We could use that as a source to derive the fire history data set. Thank you very much for your time, and hand over for questions.
Thank you very much, Grant and Dane. Grant, I have one question for you from Val. Val's asking, would we be able to use this for modeling fire spread during a fire by inputting weather?
Absolutely, yes. That is definitely something that is definitely possible. Yeah, it would just be a case of actually putting the model together, building in the relative weather conditions for that day and for that period, and it would definitely be something one could do.
Okay. If anyone else has any further questions, if you'd make yourself known to me by putting a hand up through the reaction icon. Jim, you have a question?
Yes, I was just going to ask whether you've already been approached about applying the same system and model to other countries or sites. I can just imagine that will be happening.
Sorry, Jim, I think we missed your question. You've got a bit of a gap up here.
Have you already been asked about trying to apply the same?
So post the Welsh conference, we had 2 or 3 interactions with some of the participants, but it never progressed much further than that. So no, we haven't. I'm just checking. No, we haven't been asked outside of South Africa. No.
Right. Okay, there's a further question from Mark Hammond. Mark's asking, has the modeling been used for on-the-ground actions?
So that's part of what we're trying to get it across to do. So the Fire Protection Association, this is actually their product. They paid for the original one. And in last week, we were just talking to them about updating, and they will be using that for assessing the risk to their members and assessing the opportunities in the event of a fire activity. So yes, it is used. They really do know their properties quite well. That's why we could get really good information from them.
Okay. A few more positive comments about the model in the chat room. If there are any further questions, please let me know either by raising your hand or inputting a question in the chat. Doesn't seem to be any further questions coming through, but lots of positive comments.
Okay.
You both.
Listen, we'll take that. Thank you very much again. I saw your earlier presentation in Wales. It's great to see how things have developed since then, and a particular thanks to sticking with us and giving a presentation in the dark. I think I've never seen that quite before. So thank you very much. Could I take the opportunity to thank all of the speakers? I'd like to thank Lyndon for swapping round there in particular, but I think that's been a great selection of speakers. I know we're a little bit early, but there's no harm in that. If I could ask all of the speakers, and Simon, Colm, Bruce, perhaps, if you're still here, to we'll have a bit of a plenary session and try to pull some conclusions and common themes together, and perhaps open the floor as well. I've been checking that to see how everything works, so perhaps I'll leave it to yourselves in terms of drawing conclusions from the content. Okay, so over to you, Colm and Simon. Okay.
I would just like to say, thanks to all the speakers. There's a lot of common threads there, I think, running through the different themes, even though they are from different parts of the world. And it's been good to get that bit of overview between the local impact of this year through to the Mediterranean and across to America. And there's obviously a lot of good, valuable knowledge and experience out there, which I know I have, on behalf of the department, have tapped into to help me in my day-to-day work. And I thank you all for your help and assistance. We'll definitely be lifting a few suggestions and ideas from the talks and the comments today to help us start to formulate the preparation for the conference this time next year, when we can all be face-to-face rather than through the computer screen. And again, just thank you all for your time and your patience with us this evening.
Simon, over to you. Have you got any particular thoughts on themes?
No, I think it's served as yet another reminder, if we needed one, of the lessons that we can learn here in the UK from the international wildfire scene, and to pull together those lessons to inform us as we develop our own systems in the UK. To some extent, we lag behind because of out of grateful necessity that we haven't got the same conditions, but as we know, we've reiterated many times, we are expecting our conditions to change. All the discussions going on in Glasgow as we speak with the climate change conference. So we are seeing, I think, things are going to change. We need to learn lessons from the international community, as well, I think, as getting our own act together. And I think these sort of sessions are so important to share ideas, to share the views across what is a very wide range of interests. And I think we need to grab that at every opportunity, enhance it. And I think really to give a final plug, perhaps, for the conference next year, I think it's up to everyone to make the most of it, to see it as an opportunity within the UK, but also beyond on an international stage, to come together to share ideas. And the more ideas we can feed in at this stage, I think the better the conference and the better ultimately the output, and the more we'll learn and the more we'll go further forward. Because I do think it's important that we need to be seen to be taking charge of our own destiny as far as the wildfire audience is concerned, but we do need to engage with everyone from the policy. We need to engage with the governments. We need to link the policy all the way down to the land managers, or perhaps it should be up to the land managers, They're the guys who actually we need to influence to do things maybe slightly differently, to think about the training, think about the knowledge, think about the planning and preparation for wildfire incidents. And as ever, it's not if we have a wildfire, it's when.
Okay. Could I just ask you, think we have a growing number of people that are coming to these sorts of events, etc., but we're still a fairly closed shop. And it's what we can do between now and the conference, perhaps in the light of COP26, to get the decision makers and the policy makers, as you mentioned, won over, or at least in terms of engaging that. We've got a year. That seems to be the big, the next big task for ourselves. There's plenty of others, of course.
Yeah. I think it is my simple, if there is such a thing, simple answer to that, and maybe I can throw the ball to Bruce in a second as well, see what his views are from Scotland. But I think to a large extent, it's going to be driven by the agenda that we come up with for the conference. And I think, say from the Wildfire Forum's perspective, very happy to support that. But I think it ultimately has got to come from Belfast. But it's how we get that agenda such it does have the widest appeal. Is seen to be relevant, and then maybe we will get bums on seats physically, which would be jolly nice. Because we know we've always pointed the finger from the previous conferences. There haven't been enough land managers there, haven't been enough government there. Well, have we got an agenda that appeals to people, that is going to make them give up time, hopefully travel to Belfast and take part in the conference? So I think that's where we need to think. Okay. Bruce, any thoughts?
I think we've captured it really well there, Simon. If we can do a bit of engagement between now and the conference with key people to let them know that there is value in coming along, that there's a not just a UK-wide, but a Europe worldwide push in the same direction to try and mitigate the negative impact of fire on the landscape. We can identify where there's a cross-mapping between government's agenda and the wildfire agenda, and encourage land managers to attend, to let them see what the benefit is. I think to a certain extent, let them see that they are not vilified in this circle, that they're actually a key partner in it, and a very welcome partner. And far from us telling them how they should do their business, we're trying to understand how we can help them to do their business better, because they're the ones that lose livelihood when their land is burnt. They're the ones that lose revenue when they haven't got crops to sell, or they lose land from fire. So we need to do that engagement and identify to them why they're so important in our agenda. We don't want to do things to them and apply policies to them. We want them to be absolutely the heart of it, so we can assist them to get better at what they do, and by default we'll get better at what we do. But a lot of that work's underway, and Rob Gazard mentioned earlier on the joint training. I think that's a really positive step forward. If the both strands of that are pushing forward to get us all on the same page in understanding and practice, and the agenda of the conference supports all of that, then I think we've certainly moved in the right direction.
And really, just to endorse that point about getting out there, making the points, engaging with the government, I think that's something we need to do across the UK over the next 12 months, is actually get out there, get them interested in what we're trying to do, and making it very clear that they're expected to attend, because the agenda for the conference is going to play to their strengths, play to their interests. And I think within England, Wales, we are making some progress with the Home Office and DEFRA and the Cabinet Office. They're now talking to each other about wildfire. So I think that is a step forward. A long way to go, but I think it's a big step forward, and that's something hopefully we can enhance, and in the Northern Ireland context as well.
Thanks very much. I just ask if any of the speakers have any further comments, perhaps on each other's talks, or any further points that they might want to make. No. Listen, folks, I think that's been a wonderful afternoon. I think I'd like to thank everybody involved. I think we have gone through everybody already, but the speakers, I think, were outstanding, and perhaps we'll see them this time next year again. I'm just going to hand over to Helen, and I think we'll take proceedings to a natural close here. So if I could ask Helen Anderson, the CEO of NIEA, for some final comments.
Thanks very much, Jim. You gave me a wee bit of an uplift there. Unfortunately, I'm not the CEO. I don't have
Oh,
that
sorry.
check.
Well, I think you are.
But I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I'm the director of the natural heritage bit of it. So thank you very much for that. I just threw very late in the day a wee chat in there. You know, I think that point about getting getting some of the key stakeholders involved, you know, the policy people, the landowners, the members of the public. And I think it's about, and I know you're working hard at that, getting an agenda that's really going to grip them and force their engagement by setting out the costs and the opportunities, you know, that there are for them. And I think there's no harm in hanging on to the messages that are coming out of COP26, that whole low carbon, high nature. So, you know, really, can I just say, you know, this has been a wonderful event. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. You know, it's been hugely attended. You know, I think Colm had said to me we topped at 180, and I think for a large part of the day we sustained over 100 delegates, and I know that there's 18 countries represented, so it's various times of the day depending on where you are, but it's getting near dinner time for those of us in the UK, so I'll not witter on for too long. I know that you've all been very good at thanking everybody as they've gone along, and I too would really thank and commend the quality of the presentations, the quality of the questions that have been asked either verbally or in the chat, you know, so huge intelligence and huge participation from all of yourselves, so thank you very much for that. And in particular, I want to thank you know, Belfast Hills Partnership for setting up this event and for the work that they're doing going forward in terms of organising the conference, COVID permitting, you know, for next year. I particularly want to thank the wonderful double act that we have in Jim and Noel. They have been outstanding. So thank you very much for keeping that all moving deftly along. And I think for me, you know, there's been a real emphasis that, and I know one of the ladies made the point earlier, you know, we have a shared problem here, we have a shared challenge, and it's global, it's not national. And that, you know, collaboration and cooperation are really going to be essential in going forward, in dealing much more meaningfully with that. And I think there'll be a strength. I think that's another way to get you know, governments and indeed the public to take notice, is whenever you're speaking with an international voice. We've seen that at COP as well. So I think there's a lot to build on that. I would also suggest that maybe looking at COP15, I think it's next March, the second half of COP15 with focus on nature, there might be something there that you can usefully build on. Some of the targets coming out of the Convention on Biological Diversity might be useful, and Mark Hammond will point you right, and as I'm sure others will, in terms of that. So you know, really, can I just say thank you very much to everybody, and it'll be terrific if all goes well and we're able to see each other face to face in Belfast next November. So please keep that in your diaries, and please be looking out for, you know, and do please feed in any further ideas that you have in terms of that conference. So just a huge thank you to everybody, and in particular to Jim and Noel. Very well done, guys.
Thank you very much for that. And Helen, will be looking to you as well for ideas as to what would be an agenda that would grip particularly the local politicians, but beyond as well. Thanks very much for that. And can I thank Simon and Bruce and all those that have participated. I'm not going to hold it much longer. I can't believe we're actually finished at half an hour early, but I think that's been extremely useful. And I think we'll call it to a close. Thank you very much. Cheers now. Bye.